And the last speaker today is Anton Vidokle. He's an artist based in New York, founding director of e-flux and editor of e-flux magazine, and a curator as well, or?
No curator.
And the talk of Anton is Art Without Work, искусство без произведения.
Я хотел, во-первых, поблагодарить Бориса за то, что он меня пригласил. Очень приятно приехать в Москву. И я, как остальные участники этой конференции, буду читать по-английски, поэтому прошу прощения. Recently, I recalled the precise moment when it first occurred to me that I would like to become an artist. I grew up in Moscow, and my father was a self-taught musician working at the circus. Circus artists work extremely hard physically. The amount of daily practice and physical exercise necessary to perform acrobatic acts or walk a tightrope is really enormous. Basically, they practice and exercise all day and perform by night. It's nearly a 24-hour job. So there was this birthday party for one of the kids in the building we lived in, which belonged to the Union of Circus Artists. All of us at this party were about 5 or 6 years old, children of clowns, animal trainers, and so forth. We were watching a cartoon on TV, and at some point a conversation started about what we wanted to become when we grow up. And following the usual things like a cosmonaut or a fireman, one of the kids said that he wanted to be a fine artist, explaining that this is because they do not work. I was very shy as a kid, so I did not say much, but thought to myself that this boy must be really, really clever, and I too do not want to work and should therefore try to become an artist. Ironically, this momentary realization ultimately pointed me on a trajectory that led to a perpetual state of work for many years. While my classmates in school tended to just hang out or play sports after classes, I went to drawing lessons every night. When my family moved to America, I enrolled in 3 schools simultaneously: School of Visual Arts by day, Artist Students League classes by night, and collective live drawing lessons on weekends. Somehow the idea of not working went out the window, and all throughout my artistic education, the emphasis was on work, the idea being that I had to fill all my available time with learning and practice, and that the sheer effort was bound to make me an artist. Thinking was of relatively little importance within this scenario. Sometime in graduate school, I did start to get a sense that all this was not really getting me very far artistically, that some other approach or modality of practice was possible. However, it was very confusing and mystifying what this other way could possibly be. It was not so much about becoming more of a slacker artist, but a realization that a different type of engagement was necessary. Since the early 20th century, much of the advanced analysis of art production refers to the position of the artist and the intellectual as cultural workers. I think that it probably seemed advantageous and desirable to see yourself and have others perceive you as a member of the most dynamic class, a class that was expected to dominate the making of history, the working class. While rereading the Communist Manifesto some years ago, it was very interesting to note how sure Marx was that the middle class, from which a vast majority of cultural producers actually come from, is merely a small and historically insignificant group that is destined to vanish during the final confrontation between bourgeoisie and the proletariat, a battle from which the proletariat was expected to emerge victorious. What progressive agent of culture would want to belong to this vanishing species? To this day, many in the field of contemporary art insist on usage of the term cultural producer, a term that now supposedly blurs the difference between different members of the art industry, artists, curators, critics, historians, administrators, and patrons of art, on the assumption that we're all working together to produce meaning and thus culture. Much of this language and thinking is predicated on the privileged position of work, that in order for art to come into being, work needs to be done. Hard work, important work, expert work, work of art, artwork. While there is a lot of disagreement about what type of work is actually required, who should or can do it, and if and how they should be trained for it, it is rarely questioned whether work is actually necessary or essential to the production of art. Duchamp mused if there could be a work not of art, but can there also be art without work. The ready-made is something that immediately comes to mind, yet I feel that using existing objects produced by labor of others does not solve this particular problem, because it is simply not about delegating, outsourcing, or appropriating. Furthermore, while making art object requires labor and work, art does not exclusively belong to the realm of objects. It seems to me that art largely resides within and in between subjects, and the subject does not require work to produce him or herself. Falling in love, having a religious or aesthetic experience does not require work, so why should art require work to come into being? It would be useful here to refer to the distinctions that Hannah Arendt draws between labor, work, and action. For Arendt, labor corresponds to a basic need for human life to sustain itself, such as farming, preparation of food, etc. Work goes beyond satisfaction of immediate needs and corresponds to human ability to build and maintain a world fit for human use, while action is the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things or matter and corresponds to the human condition of plurality. I suppose Arendt's understanding of this was inspired by the ancient Greeks, who, unlike Marxists, frowned on the idea of work. Labor was for slaves. Free citizens were expected to engage in politics, not work. The only type of occupation not looked down upon apparently was that of a shepherd, presumably because when one walks around in the fields with animals, one is fully present yet is not occupied and is free to think. While I am not completely sure that action, in Arendt's beautiful definition, is always applicable in describing conditions that enable production of art, I suspect that certain types of art practices can turn labor and work into action, and in doing so, free art from dependence on labor and work. Historically, there have been different approaches to realizing this, yet all seem to converge around a concern with conditions of production. If art is produced as an outcome of certain conditions, rather than simply an act of genius which is not interesting or possible to discuss, then creating such conditions would actually produce art. If ultimate conditions of productions are the world and life, rather than studio or an art museum, it would then follow that a certain way of living, of being in the world, would in itself result in production of art. No work is necessary. A concern with such interdependence between art and life and the state of the subject therein was very much the preoccupation of many artists of the 20th century avant-garde. It seems that the thinking at the time was not only about the production of a new way of life that would result in the production of a groundbreaking revolutionary art, but also the other way around, that the production of a new type of art would result in a new way of life and in turn a new subject. One of the instances of this would be the Left magazine, co-published by Rodchenko, Mayakovsky, and others, the explicit stated goal of which was to produce such a new subject through exposing its readers to new content and new form, to new art. Last winter, I spent a lot of time looking at Andy Warhol's films from around mid-1960s. What is really fascinating is the complex structure he put in place for the production of these films. While Warhol's silkscreen paintings from this period gather most attention from art historians, in part because they're expensive objects in museum and private collections, it is as if he basically made them to fund the production of the films, which were expensive to make but produced no income. It's tempting to understand this simply as a situation where someone does some work, some money work, to fund the production of the real work, the films. However, this type of simple dichotomy does not play here. While Warhol is very blunt about his apparent indifference to the production of his paintings and objects in interviews from that period, not only are the paintings and objects physically made by studio assistants, even their subject matter is determined by others. Warhol's involvement in films is not very different. The screenplays are written by someone else. He does not direct the actors or shoot or edit them. The set is, for most part, is just his studio, as is, the factory. One of my personal favorites is a film called The Couch, in which, according to Gerard Malanga, who found the red couch on the street and brought it to the factory, every time other activities at the factory were finished or exhausted, someone would just start filming the couch, including whatever was taking place on it at the moment, conversations, eating, sex, and so forth. Furthermore, the films do not seem to be made to be watched in their entirety, which is something that would be hard for most filmmakers to accept. You want your audience to see the totality of your work, no matter how experimental. It's very frustrating when people stop paying attention and leave midway through the piece. Yet the majority of Warhol's films seem to have a built-in indifference to this. In one of the interviews I saw from 1966 or so, Warhol says point blank that he has not worked in 3 years and is not working at the time of this interview. It is easy to assume that this is only another evasive maneuver or a provocation that he was so good at during his interviews, yet it seems to me that he was actually being very direct. Having created certain conditions for production, he was present, yet he did not need to work in order for really significant art to come into being. It also seems to me that the most important mechanism of the factory, its central activity, was not so much production of art objects or films, but production of very specific social relations, a new lifestyle which in turn resulted in films and other things. Warhol, the proponent of business art, may seem to be artistically far from the idealist or utopian avant-garde, but actually the structures he was using were not so dissimilar. A certain kind of a depersonalization of a work of art using a collective approach rooted in setting up a certain type of a creative community, strangely reminiscent of the style, Bauhaus, and so forth, all of which place just as strong of an emphasis on reorganization of life and social relations as on production of art. I find that far from being dated or obsolete, this type of a model is of a particular significance today, further facilitated and amplified by the emergence of powerful and free tools for communication, production, and dissemination, such as the internet, which creates a certain possibility of an autonomy from capital. A different yet sympathetic approach to networking can be found in the artistic practice of Rirkrit Tiravanija. A couple of years ago, we did something in New York which involved turning e-flux storefront into a kind of a free diner discussion space where 3 days of conversations on contemporary art took place during lunch and dinner sessions, which is actually what you're looking at. This is a 16mm footage shot during these 3 days in New York. The conversations were subsequently transcribed, edited, and published as an issue of A Priori magazine. While there were a number of specially invited speakers, the conversations were open to participation from anyone from the floating public attending the event. Cooking was done largely by Rirkrit, with some help from his assistants and friends. To be honest, I never noticed how much Rirkrit actually works when he does this cooking thing for a large number of people. Each of the 3 days started very early, around 7 or 8 in the morning, with shopping for food. Food preparation started around 11 to be ready in time for the lunch sessions, followed by a couple of hours of cleaning. Then shopping again for dinner, because there was no refrigerator and it was during a very hot New York summer, cooking and cleaning again until past midnight. Not having a real equipped kitchen makes food preparation, washing, and cleaning very labor-intensive. On the other hand, spending most of his time in the improvised kitchen in our backyard allowed Rirkrit not to engage in the conversation and not to speak or answer questions about his art, which is something I think he does not like to do. When I asked if what he was doing is art, Rirkrit said no, he's just cooking. I think what happens here is that rather than speaking I think what happens here is that rather than speak or work in the capacity of an artist, Rirkrit prefers to make himself very busy doing something else in the space of art. A simple analogy is when the time came to write this paper, I noticed that I suddenly started cleaning my apartment, washing dishes, watering plants, even went and got a new haircut. In other words, doing all sorts of work in order to avoid having to work in this particular capacity. Furthermore, not unlike the factory, yet dispersed amidst many different art venues and dates, Rirkrit's activity manages to temporarily construct a rather peculiar set of social relations between those in attendance. While he displaces the art object and the figure of the artist, perhaps reflecting Duchamp, from its traditional center stage, literally to the kitchen, his presence usually forms a quiet, yet an influential and shaping center for those present. Rirkrit does manage to produce art while not working in the capacity of an artist, yet to do so, he really makes himself very busy. He works very hard doing something else. An artist today can aspire to a certain kind of sovereignty. This means that unlike artists who work, let's say, before the French Revolution, at least in theory, we can decide what kind of practice do we want to have, what subject matter is important to us, what is it that we decide to do, and not merely to satisfy a commission of a patron or a client, but to follow our internal interest or in response to urgent events. This feels so natural now, yet only a few hundred years ago, this type of a position was pretty much inconceivable. I was in Rome recently, which is a city filled with art commissioned by the church, and just imagine an artist during Renaissance, for example, painting frescoes or carving marble sculptures as a sort of a personal art project. It is important to keep in mind that the possibility of such sovereignty did not just happen by itself, but was a result of a long struggle for independence from the church, from the aristocracy, from public taste, from the critics, and so on. However, the sovereignty is perpetually being contained and contested by the institutions of art, art market, and critical establishment. While as an artist you may think that you are free to do what you want, in order for it to be economically sustainable, critically acknowledged, or just even to bring it into contact with the art public, it needs to conform to certain network protocols that dictate what sort of art production could enter the network. With the ever-increasing professionalization of artists, curators, and others in the field of art, it seems to me that the industry of contemporary art is actually moving towards a certain restoration of a more hierarchical position vis-à-vis the artist. For example, recently I was invited to take part in the Shanghai Biennial together with Liam Gillick. The invitation from the artistic director was a very long letter basically telling us exactly what he wanted us to make for him. A discursive situation with a group of artists, curators, and theorists that would be Brechtian and evoke the form of a theater rehearsal, and a reference to the 1926 Russian play called The Roar of China. We were taken a bit aback by how prescriptive this invitation was, and how it placed us in a position of some content producers for hire. We wrote back suggesting that since he knows so clearly what it is that he needs for his show, perhaps he should just do it himself. Fortunately, this person was intelligent enough to take a step back and ask us what we would like to do instead. Unfortunately, this type of a situation is becoming more and more common these days. The problem is that all this makes it much more difficult for artists to do more than simply satisfy a demand from institutions or markets of art, which lack imagination or creativity. So if an artist were to develop a kind of a practice requiring a new institutional configuration in order to manifest itself, today this would mean that in addition to producing art, one also has to produce the conditions that enable such production and its channels of distribution. The production of these conditions can become so critical to the production of art that it can assume the shape of art itself. Naturally, all this is also interesting to me because of e-flux. e-flux was started in 1998 through sheer accident. With a couple of friends, I was organizing a kind of a strange overnight exhibition in a hotel room of a Chinatown Holiday Inn in New York. The show was called The Best Surprise is No Surprise, after Holiday Inn corporate slogan from the 1970s. And we had just enough money to rent the room, but nothing extra to print invitations or posters, or even to do a mailing of a press release. At the time, I had just opened my first email account with Hotmail and thought that we could try to email press releases to our show to a group of friends. Not very many people were using email then, so we maybe sent about 30 or 40 such emails. Yet something totally unexpected happened, and more than 500 people came to the hotel room that night. In fact, it was actually quite intimidating because, we thought that certainly people would kick us out from the hotel because it's very strange that so many people try to go to a hotel room. So this taking place in New York, we lied and we kind of told them that what is happening is that we're auditioning for a film. And the film would be a film about the art world, and the director is this very eccentric Japanese film director who is only in town for one night. And the New York film industry has such incredible influence over everyday life that if you say you're shooting a film, you're allowed to do just about anything. So nobody bothered us, and people came. But in the morning, the people from the hotel knocked on the door and walked in, and basically we found out that the reason why they knocked is they also wanted to be auditioned to be considered to be actors in this film. So our bluff was called, but by that time the show was over and everything was fine. In the following days, I thought that this is something that could be organized into a resource for others in our field, artists, independent curators, alternative spaces, basically all those who were doing interesting things but did not have the means to disseminate information about them. With a group of friends, we started e-flux, and what followed is that the readership of this newsletter just snowballed. In the beginning, it was approximately 500 readers, and 5,000, 15,000, 50,000, and so forth. Now it's approximately 70,000. This resulted in a revenue stream that made it possible to produce various projects, books, exhibitions, and to do this in a way that is independent of capital, of patrons or funders. Simultaneously, e-flux as a communication platform made it possible for these projects not to be marginalized by the lack of institutional legitimation or mainstream art press, which normally do not pay much attention to experimental projects. The early e-flux projects, such as the next Documenta should be curated by an artist, organized by Jens Hoffman, or the Image Bank for Everyday Revolutionary Life, an image bank based on the photo archive of a Mexican muralist, David Alfaro Sequeiros, were largely online projects. However, in 2004, Julieta Aranda suggested that we give up our artist studio that we shared for e-flux work and our individual artistic practice and rent a storefront, a public accessible space for our work. We rented a small shop on Ludlow Street and started a series of projects which were not precisely art exhibitions, but perhaps closer to models or structures for a different way of dissemination or circulation of art. The first of these experiments was e-flux video rental, literally a video rental shop for single-channel video works and art films. Inspired by the peculiar way in which certain small businesses sometimes fill the void created by the privatization of space in urban centers like New York, we conceived this project as something that would function both as a meeting place for people interested in video art and as a matrix for dissemination of video art into people's private spaces. Our video rental was free of charge, and you could use it as an informal research library, or you could become a member and take videos home for a couple of nights. We were not interested in setting up a kind of an authoritative, curated archive of important video works. So then, rather than choosing individual works ourselves, we invited a large group of selectors, artists, curators, art historians, to put together small modules of this project, numerous selections of 4 or 5 works, which in total comprise more than 1,000 videos and art films. Very shortly after we opened the shop, we started to receive invitations from various institutions to travel it. So for the past 5 years, it has been continuously traveling through approximately 20 cities, from Seoul to Istanbul to Boston, and to finally end in Ljubljana in the permanent collection of the Moderna Galleria, who are now entrusted with preserving and maintaining this project. Somewhat similar in nature was a public library that we opened in our shop following the video rental, comprising of a vast book collection of the American artist Martha Rosler. This happened partially in response to my visit to an estate of Donald Judd in Marfa, Texas, which included a huge collection of books acquired by Judd during his life, which cannot be touched even by researchers because of a peculiar estate stipulation that nothing in his house can be moved from where it was on the day he died. When I told the story to Martha, she joked that she also has almost 10,000 books that she would like to get rid of because they're blocking all the space in her small house. I suggested that she lends the books to us for some time, and she agrees. After staying at e-flux, Martha's library traveled to Frankfurt, to Antwerp, Paris, Berlin, and other cities as an exhibition before finally returning to Martha's house last year. Perhaps one of the most involved and complex projects for us up to date was United Nations Plaza, an experimental school that we opened in Berlin in 2006, following the cancellation of Manifesto 6 in Cyprus. This time, rather than circulating videos or books, the focus was on dissemination of ideas through a year-long series of free public seminars with Boris Groys, Liam Gillick, Martha Rosler, Walid Rad, Jalal Tawfiq, Natasha Sadr-Hakigian, and Turdad Zelgadar. This took place in a small building we rented in East Berlin, located behind a supermarket at the United Nations Plaza, formerly Lenin Plaza. After Berlin, United Nations Plaza traveled to Mexico and to New York's new museum under a new name, Night School. Although the cycle of schools is now finished, I feel that it's very much continues through e-flux Journal, a monthly online publication we started in 2008 together with Brian Kwan Wood, himself actually a student at night school, in which many of the collaborators from the United Nations Plaza are now key contributors. Most currently, Julieta Aranda and I started a bank, a time bank. Time banking is an existing movement in alternative economics that traces its origins to 1830s, when in response to the misery brought on by industrialization and early capitalism, American anarchist Josiah Warren and British industrialist Robert Owens simultaneously developed alternative currencies and economic systems based on time and labor exchange. In 1991, during the last recession in the United States, Paul Glover set up a first modern labor exchange and reintroduced time currency in Ithaca, New York. Following his example, through Time Bank, we want to develop a tool or a platform which enables people in the arts to get things done without the use of money, something that we hope to build into a viable parallel economy. While these types of projects are not entirely free from collaboration with existing institutions of art, they do manage to assert a certain degree of sovereignty, in part by assuming curatorial and organizational methodologies, often in combination with discursive and collective modes of production. They do so also in part by shifting the activity of an artist to work in a different capacity through a refusal to perform the artist's work. Thanks very much. This is the end. We can turn on the lights now.